Jane sees a little black girl making a hand gesture in the restaurant where she works. She immediately calls the police, and what happens next is shocking. 25-year-old Jane was having just another day at the restaurant where she worked as a waitress. The restaurant was known to be a popular stopping point for people looking for a quick and tasty meal. With her perfectly clean apron and welcoming smile, Jane served customers with care and kindness. She walked around the place, took orders, served dishes, and generally made sure that all customers were satisfied. The charismatic Jane had been working at the restaurant for 3 years, and most of the customers were devoted to her. As the day progressed, the restaurant became less crowded. It was then that a tall black man entered the restaurant with a little girl. The little girl appeared to be about 10 years old, and it was clear from their remarkable resemblance that she was the man's daughter. Jane watched with deep interest as the couple slowly made their way to a table. At first glance, the two looked very normal father and daughter, but there was something about the way the little girl walked that caught Jane's attention. There was a hesitation, a subtle discomfort in the little girl's movements that did not go unnoticed by the experienced waitress. The child appeared quite nervous and tired. Something immediately suggested to Jane that this couple was different, that there was something unusual about it. Jane watched carefully as the man and the little girl sat at a table not far from the counter where she was standing. The man called a nearby waiter and ordered sandwiches, hamburgers, and glasses of orange juice. He also ordered 3 meals to take home. Jane noticed that the man devoured his food once it was served, while the little girl merely ate little. Jane also noticed that the girl was nervously looking around the restaurant like she was looking for someone. Just then, the little girl's listless gaze met Jane's, and their eyes met for a long moment. Then the little girl abruptly looked away from Jane, but continued to look at Jane at intervals, imploringly, like begging the waitress to do something. Jane then realized that the man was abruptly signaling the child to finish her meal. Jane instinctively sensed that the man had something fishy, and that the child definitely looked like she needed help. The kind waitress realized that she could not continue to stand there. Jane decided that she had to do something and do it quickly to help the little girl, whom she felt was in danger. So she approached the table of the two and politely asked if they needed anything else. While keeping his gaze on the frightened child, the man answered Jane firmly, stating that they did not need anything, and clearly showing that he was trying to discharge her. As Jane turned to leave, he decided to take one last look at the little girl, and it was then that she realized. The child was looking at the man, but her left hand was under the table, pointing toward Jane. On the child's open palm was a huge letter X drawn in red ink. Jane was petrified when she saw the sign, because she knew the message quite well. It was a common universal appeal for help for women experiencing some form of violence. Jane turned abruptly and hurried to the counter, still feeling quite dizzy. Standing at the counter, Jane kept her eyes on the little girl, who kept looking at her at intervals with her usual pleading gaze. Jane reflected on what to do. Then she hurried to join her colleague named Esther, who was at the back of the restaurant. Once she reached her, Jane told her friend and colleague everything almost in apnea. Esther was horrified. The two colleagues immediately began planning what to do. Eventually, they both came to the decision to call the police. Jane pulled the phone out of her pocket, called the police and told them everything that had happened. She also gave the interlocutor the address of the restaurant. Jane and Esther then rushed to the counter, but to their shock, the man and the little girl were nowhere to be found. They seemed to have disappeared into nothingness. Just 10 minutes later, 2 officers entered the restaurant and approached the counter where they met Jane and Esther. After telling them that she was the one who had called them, Jane told the agents everything she had seen about the man and the little girl. One of the officers pulled a small notebook out of his pocket and noted some of the facts as Jane spoke. At the conclusion of her story, the waitress pointed the officers to the table at which the man and the little girl had been sitting. The officers immediately headed to the vacated table. On the table were still the silverware and glasses that the man and girl had used. A waitress wanted to clear the table, but Jane politely told her that she would take care of it herself. She knew the cops might need what was on that table. Once they arrived at the table, the two officers' inspection began. Before they touched anything on the table, they put on their gloves. One of the agents pulled a sealed bag from his pocket, and with the swab expertly and meticulously scraped the glasses and cutlery looking for fingerprints and DNA samples. Next, the officer carefully placed the sample back into a sealed bag and packed up some of the items. At the end of their work at the table, the agents returned to Jane and thanked her for her cooperation. Then, they both left the restaurant to return to the police station. The case was handed over to two detectives named Joe and Sam. The experienced detectives immediately began working on the case with all of the collected proof. They first sent the swab and items to the appropriate laboratory for identification of any DNA and fingerprint samples. 3 days later, the laboratory sent the investigators the results of the analysis, which were positive. 2 DNA samples belonging to the father and daughter, and 2 fingerprint samples had been extracted during the analysis. Joe and Sam felt satisfied because they were already making progress with the case. Then they examined the DNA and fingerprint samples in the city police database for a possible match. Joe and Sam checked the samples using the state database, but the result was negative. The detectives were not discouraged. They were quite experienced and had dealt with similar situations before. They decided to compare the samples with the federal police DNA and fingerprint database, which was obviously the last attempt. Eureka! Here's the fingerprint match. His name was Matt Davis, and he had been previously arrested and booked for DUI and speeding in a neighboring state when he was 25 years old. Sam and Joe were relieved. They had finally found their man. The two detectives tracked down Matt's residence exactly 1 week after the incident at the restaurant. A SWAT team of 6 officers traveled to Matt's home in 2 police cars. Upon reaching Matt's house early that morning, one of the officers knocked hard on the front door. There was no response, but after the second attempt at knocking, it was precisely the man Jane had seen with the child at the restaurant that memorable morning who opened the door. At the sight of the policeman, the sleepy-looking Matt initially appeared very stunned, but quickly regained his composure. One of the officers greeted Matt and asked him where the little girl he had been seen with at the restaurant a week earlier was. "The little girl?" asked Mark with a puzzled expression, like he was trying to remember something. "Oh, that must be my beautiful little girl, Franca," Matt said with a smile. "It was her birthday, so I took her out for a special present as usual, but she's not here with me at the moment. She left for a vacation in Africa with her mother," Matt concluded, sounding quite confident. But of course the cops didn't believe that. The officer talking to Matt showed him a search warrant and ordered him to leave the house and stay with 2 officers outside while the rest of the cops searched the house. The policeman had easily obtained the search warrant from a judge because the safety of a child was involved. Matt smiled at the officer and left the house, as he had been ordered. 2 officers stayed with him outside, while the others promptly entered the house for the search. The agents opened all the rooms of the house and meticulously searched every corner of the house, but there was no sign of anyone. The officers also inspected the room they believed to be the child's. While in the room, the officers noticed that the bed had not been used for sleeping for some time, which seemed to coincide with Matt's story that his daughter and wife were on vacation. Or was there something else to this deepening mystery? The officers wondered. After nearly an hour, the agents had searched the entire house and were standing outside when one of them instinctively headed toward a thick curtain in the living room. The agent moved the curtain as his colleagues looked at him puzzled. And most surprising, behind the thick curtain was a door. Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us. Thank you very much. The three officers immediately rushed to the door behind the curtain. They opened it and immediately realized that the door led to the basement of the house. The basement was extremely dark, so the agents turned on their powerful flashlights and headed for the stairs. As the agents went deeper into the basement, the crying voice of a little girl was heard. "Daddy, please. Mommy has a high fever. She's sick." All the officers were petrified. They were locked for a moment, looking at each other as they struggled to identify the direction of the cries. Then, as if a whistle had been heard, all the officers began to run toward the source of the shouts. When the first officer reached the bottom of the basement, he pointed his flashlight at a corner next to him, and what he found was unbelievable and shocking. On the floor, and chained to the metal bars of the windows with long chains, were a young woman and a little girl crying. The duo looked extremely messy, and the whole place smelled extremely bad. The other officers arrived on the scene and were all greeted by the same horrible sight. "Calm down, baby. We are police officers and we are here to help you." One of the officers told the crying little girl, and she immediately stopped crying and started shaking the woman who seemed to be unconscious or asleep. He cried for joy. "Mom is not Dad, it's the police, and they are here to help us." The woman seemed to recover a little. The policemen were ready to do their duty. One officer radioed the two officers outside and told them to quickly take Matt to the basement. Another officer called for an ambulance. As the other officers bent down and began to examine the woman, they calmed the child with reassuring words. Soon, Matt arrived in the basement with two officers pointing guns at him and following him closely. This time, Matt seemed genuinely frightened, knowing well that his game was over. The officers ordered him to immediately release the woman and the child. Matt, with trembling hands, pulled a key out of his pocket and immediately did as he was ordered. The officers handcuffed him and took him outside to the patrol car. The ambulance arrived just 15 minutes after the officers' call. The medics rushed into the basement with stretchers and, with the help of the officers, loaded the still-looking unconscious woman and the exhausted child onto the stretchers. They then carefully carried them to the ambulance waiting outside, where both began receiving immediate first aid treatment as the ambulance pulled away to a nearby hospital. The officers later searched the basement for any possible evidence. The room was covered with plastic cards of meals eaten at home and empty water bottles. There was also a metal bucket with a top at the far end of the basement. It was probably kept there as a temporary toilet. After finishing in the basement, the officers all headed outside with the evidence, and with Matt already inside one of the patrol cars, resting his head on his lap, the officers got into the cars and headed to the police station. At the hospital, doctors examined the woman and the girl. They discovered that both were very malnourished and that the woman had a severe fever. Both the woman and the girl received the best medical care, and the woman gradually but steadily recovered with each passing day. Matt was taken into custody once the police officers arrived at the police station. Joe and Sam tried to question him twice, but Matt refused to say a word to the detectives. 5 days later, the two detectives arrived at the hospital to talk to the woman who had recovered enough to talk to the policemen. The woman told them that her name was Jenny, and that her daughter's name was Franca. The detectives then asked Jenny to tell her story, and she provided a very disturbing report. According to Jenny's narration, Matt was an obsessive husband. He had lost his high-paying job at a marketing firm and immediately turned to dealing on the side of local bosses. Jenny knew that it would not be long before the law found Matt and had warned him several times to stop doing dirty business. But all her warnings went unheeded, so she regularly threatened to leave him. Matt always brought her expensive jewelry and threw it at Jenny, but she threw it back at him, telling him she did not want any part of his illicit money. These actions annoyed Matt, however, who yelled at her that he risked his life on the street just to make her happy, and that she never appreciated his efforts. The situation was so bad that Jenny could no longer stand it. So one day she packed her bags and told Matt that she was finally leaving him forever. Matt, however, didn't want it to end this way. Suddenly, he became madly agitated and pushed her to the floor. Then he dragged her forcefully to the basement and chained her up. Jenny was working as a teacher, and this was during the first week of her break. Matt rushed upstairs, dragged Franca, who was sleeping, out of bed, and took her to the basement where he chained her. Matt brought just 2 takeout meals and 2 bottles of water a day to the basement for his wife and daughter. Matt was definitely on drugs and acting completely crazy. Then, on Franca's 10th birthday, Matt got her out of the basement for the first time in about 3 weeks and ordered her to take a shower and put on her best dress. When she had completed the task, Matt sang "Happy Birthday" to her and told her she was going out with him to celebrate her birthday. Franca told the cops that she had secretly taken her mother's red lipstick while she was getting dressed and had drawn the X on her palm. The sign she had shown the generous maid and eventually saved her and her mother. At the end of these incredible revelations, the detectives were both shocked. They looked at each other and then at the woman and her daughter with total consternation. Later, the 2 detectives talked with Matt about all the information they had gathered from his wife and daughter. With his head bowed, Matt finally confessed his crimes. He also revealed to the detectives that he had told anyone who bothered to ask about his wife and daughter that they had both gone to Africa for a vacation, just as he had initially told the policeman. And because Jenny was an only child and both her parents were dead, she had no family to worry about her. Just a month later, Matt was brought to court for assault, injury to a minor, enslavement, and drug dealing. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Jenny and Franca were both in the courtroom after the verdict was read when Matt was taken away just as Franca and her mother were leaving the courtroom, the little girl called Jane, who had been following the case closely from the beginning. Franca rushed over to smiling Jane, who hugged the little girl. The little girl continued to thank the kind waitress for her help, between tears of joy. Jane kept consoling Franca and patting her on the back as she tried hard to hold back her own tears. Jenny stood looking at the duo in amazement. Finally, Franca took Jane by the arms and went to her mother, then introduced her to Jenny as the kind waitress who had rescued them. Jenny sincerely thanked Jane for her help. The 3 remained best friends forever. Jenny immediately asked for a divorce from Matt, which was granted almost immediately. She then focused on assisting herself and her daughter to overcome the trauma they had suffered. It took some time, but eventually they both made significant progress and moved on with their lives. A couple of years later, Jenny fell in love with a kind and loving man named Kevin. He welcomed Franca as if she were his own daughter, and the little girl was thrilled to finally have a real father figure in her life. Did you enjoy this story? And would you have acted like Jane? Do you think there are many men like Matt in the world? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video and subscribe to this channel. It's always great when justice triumphs in the end. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.